Welcome to the deep dive. We take your research pile, pull out the key stuff so you're perfectly informed. Okay, so today we are tackling something really tricky in storytelling. How do you actually stick the landing on a fantasy film?
Mm-hmm. It's a big one.
Yeah, you tasked us with digging into, the structure of what makes a fantasy ending feel truly satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
And right away, our sources highlight why it's such a huge challenge. Fantasy films, they try to whisk us off to these incredible new lands, sometimes across time, different dimensions.
It's like the high wire act of cinema,
Yeah.
really. The sources we looked at make it pretty clear that if the plot gets too ambitious, maybe too sprawling,
Yeah.
it's just incredibly easy for the whole narrative to fly off the rails, so they put it. You end up with a conclusion that just feels alienating or disconnected somehow.
Right. The risk is the magic just sort of overwhelms the actual message or the character arc. So the criteria for a perfect ending, it turns out, aren't really about like the biggest spectacle. It's more about coherence. The consensus seems to be that the really great fantasy films keep you absolutely hooked until that final scene. They give you a well-rounded and plausible ending where, and I like this phrasing, every character is accounted for.
Yeah, that's key. No loose threads.
Basically, a fantasy film is only as good as its ending. It lives or dies by that final impression.
And we've taken the 7 films highlighted in the research as having these, quote, perfect conclusions and sort of grouped them. We're looking for patterns. And what we've kind of seen emerge are maybe 2 main ways fantasy endings really succeed. You've got what we could call earned glory. The hero gets the big, fantastic external reward.
Right, the kingdom, the magic sword, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Or there's the other path, internal reconciliation. This is more about the protagonist accepting the often difficult truth of their normal, non-magical reality.
Ah, okay. That's a really useful distinction. Earned glory versus internal reconciliation. That's the tension we should look for. So for you listening, we're searching for those aha moments. Why do these specific endings work so well? Whether they end up happy or, totally devastating or somewhere in between.
Right. It's about the underlying mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this. First category, endings that lean heavily on a meta-narrative or that jarring return to reality, the ones that force that immediate internal reconciliation. And we kind of have to start with the prototype, don't we? The 1939 classic, The Wizard of Oz.
Oh, absolutely. It's the original lesson in, appreciating what you already have. Dorothy goes on this huge, colorful, wild adventure, only to wake up and realize, and this is the potentially tricky part, it had all been a dream.
Which, yeah, on its own could feel like a total cheat, right? You'd feel ripped off as an audience member. But the perfect insight here, according to the source, isn't just the dream reveal. It's the payoff after she wakes up. That moment where she's in her bed and she's surrounded by all those familiar faces, her Aunt Em, Uncle Henry, the farmhands.
The Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion.
Exactly. Her biggest supporters in reality were also her key companions in Oz.
The ending uses that meta connection so brilliantly. It doesn't just erase the magic, it reframes it entirely. Dorothy doesn't actually need to go back to Oz because her reality, as the source puts it, was actually far more magical than her trip to a new world. It lands the emotional journey firmly back home.
It grounds that whole chaotic adventure in one simple idea. The real magic is the people who care about you. And we see that same kind of powerful frame story being absolutely central to the success of the next film on the list, The Princess Bride. The main plot wraps up with Wesley and Buttercup. They ride off, the sunset, the big kiss.
The classic fairy tale ending. That is the earned glory for them, right? As you wish, true love conquers all. But interestingly, the sources argue that the real, maybe even better ending is the meta-narrative, the frame.
The story within a story. The grandfather reading the book to his sick grandson in that very final scene, it's just genius.
It really is. The grandfather closes the book, he's ready to leave, and the grandson, who was initially so skeptical about this kissing book.
Right, he just wanted action.
Yeah, he begs his grandfather, read it again.
Oh.
It lands perfectly. That ending reinforces the power of storytelling itself. The boy finds immense comfort in this fantasy world, just like the audience has.
It lifts the whole film, doesn't it? From just a fun swashbuckler to something with this deeply tender sense of nostalgia, as the source says. Nostalgia for childhood stories. It's reconciliation, but not with like a physical place like Kansas. It's reconciliation with imagination, with the comfort stories give us.
And that's a really good transition point, actually, because if those frame stories perfect the reconciliation with home or with storytelling itself, The next batch of films shows that perfection can look really different. It can be that clean, undeniable, earned glory, or it can be something much more ambiguous, challenging even.
Right. Sometimes the audience and the protagonist really need that win within the fantastical world itself. Which brings us neatly to Stardust. High fantasy, but done so well. Tristan goes on this crazy quest to catch a falling star.
Which turns out to be a person, Naveen, naturally.
Of course. And the plot is dense. You've got witches, sky pirates, plotting princes, the whole magical kingdom of Stormhold.
Yeah, there are a lot of threads to tie up by the end.
Yeah.
And somehow it manages it with what feels like total satisfaction.
Oh, absolutely total. Yvain uses her love for... Tristan turns it into light and boom, kills the main witch. Then Tristan discovers, surprise, he's the rightful heir to Stormhold. He doesn't go back to his old life. He gets a kingdom.
This is textbook earned glory, right? The source material calls this ending very satisfying, both romantically and in terms of, like, plot resolution. Tristan gets the kingdom, his parents are reunited, he rightfully basks in the glory of his efforts. It's the big payoff fantasy often promises.
Okay, but let me push back slightly here. If perfection is just this clean, almost predictable victory, does that make it less deep? Like, is the audience really satisfied by the perfect fairy tale where everything just works out, gets the girl the crown, the parents? Does perfection need more challenge than that?
Well, that's a fair point. I think the argument is the challenge has to be in the journey. The ending needs to feel proportional to the struggle. In Stardust, the struggle was mostly external, right? The witches, the quest itself.
Sure.
But your point is spot on. Sometimes the perfection comes from an internal challenge, something the audience has to grapple with too, which leads us perfectly to the ambiguity of Pan's Labyrinth.
Ah, yes, Guillermo del Toro. This film sets up that intense duality from the start. You're constantly shifting between the brutal reality of the Spanish Civil War and this dark fairy tale world of young Ophelia, who might be Princess Milana reincarnated. The big question is always hanging there. Is this fantasy real or just her coping mechanism?
And the brilliance of the ending, I think, is that it deliberately doesn't give you a clear answer about the real-world part. Not definitively. The focus shifts. After Ophelia's heartbreaking journey through the labyrinth, we get this epilogue. And it only really addresses the magical side of things.
Right. The epilogue just tells us that Princess Moana did return to the underworld, ruled wisely, left traces of her passage. That's where the viewer finds their reconciliation, isn't it?
Exactly. It's ambiguous, but it works because it guarantees a positive outcome for one of the worlds. The magical one. Even though we don't see her ruling, that assurance that she found her rightful place, it gives the audience the closure they desperately need after all the brutality they've witnessed.
It's like it forces us to accept that sometimes maybe the only way to find peace is to believe in that other perfect reality. The story gives us, the audience, a kind of safety valve for our own grief about Ophelia's fate in the real world. You reconcile the harsh truth of the war with the promise of peace in the fantasy realm.
And this idea of reconciling with a painful truth is actually a great bridge to our final set of films. Because not all perfect endings are comforting like Oz or triumphant like Stardust. Sometimes that final scene has to deliver something much tougher. A harrowing warning, maybe? Or just a moment of quiet acceptance.
Okay, facing the dark side now. Let's start with one of the most notoriously shocking endings out there, especially for what seems like a kid's film, Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits. This is that totally madcap film, young Kevin traveling through time with these dimension-hopping dwarves.
Right, and the ending is just pure dark Gilliam surrealism. Kevin gets back home, but the threat of capital evil isn't quite gone. A piece of it has somehow infiltrated his parents' toaster.
The toaster. It's always the appliances.
And his parents, obsessed with their modern gadgets, touch the toaster, touch the residue of evil, and just poof, explode. Gone.
Even just saying toaster explosion sounds nuts. That is such a bold, you could say divisive choice for an ending. How on earth do the sources justify that as perfect?
Well, the interpretation is that it lands as a harrowing warning about the future. The whole film encourages Kevin's imagination, his love of history, right? The reading is that Kevin has finally, truly outgrown his parents, who represented this kind of boring, materialistic domesticity he needed to escape.
So getting rid of them.
In this incredibly sudden, violent way, it clears the path. It forces Kevin to use his newfound perspective, his knowledge of the past, to actually try and make a difference. It's presented as like a liberation through devastation.
Wow. So the perfection isn't in comfort, it's in the ending being completely uncompromising in its message. You escaped. You can't just go back to normal. Things have to change. That shock is such a stark contrast to the next one, the really profound, compassionate conclusion of A Monster Calls.
Oh, yeah. This film is just emotionally devastating from the start. It's about 12-year-old Connor dealing with his mother's terminal cancer diagnosis. He's guided, or perhaps haunted, by this ancient yew tree monster. It's all about confronting the absolute worst reality imaginable.
And the ending is heartbreaking. No way around it. Connor does lose his mother. That fear becomes reality. But the structural payoff, the reason the source calls it perfect, comes in that final reveal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We find out it wasn't just Connor who met the monster. His mother did too when she was young. It suggests the monster was always there, like a guardian for the family across generations.
Yes, and what's so fascinating and kind of beautiful about it is that the ending finds its compassion because it fully embraces the grief. It doesn't shy away. It shows that even after Connor faced his absolute worst fear, losing her, he still had support, he had people, and he had this ancient, protective, maybe fantastical being still there.
It finds light right in the middle of that darkness.
Yeah, the source calls it a tonic in a world bombarded by grief and loss. It gives the audience, and Connor, permission to mourn, but also assures them that protection, that support is still possible.
Okay, so if A Monster Calls found perfection in accepting this intense, tragic reality, our final example finds it in almost the opposite. The return to, maybe boring, but restorative normalcy, where the wild things are.
Yes, this is a perfect final film to discuss. Max argues with his mom, runs away, finds this island, becomes king of the wild things, gets way too much power, kind of messes things up, realizes he doesn't actually want all that chaos and responsibility.
Right. Been there.
So he leaves the wild things, sails back home.
And his mom. She just has dinner waiting. She's there. They eat. He falls asleep right there at the table. Compared to being king of all wild things, it seems, well, anticlimactic. Almost mundane.
But that's the quiet genius of it, isn't it? That internal reconciliation again. The fact that dinner is waiting, the quiet way they come back together. That's the point. The source suggests he can finally find peace with the mundanity of everyday life. After touching ultimate kind of terrifying power, the biggest comfort is just being home. Being loved, accepted the smallness, the safety of his regular life.
It's a validation of the ordinary, which is actually pretty profound after all that fantasy.
So wrapping this all up, what does this tell us? We looked at 7 really different films.
Yeah, wildly different tones and outcomes.
What really stands out is that perfect definitely isn't one-size-fits-all in fantasy endings. But we did spot those 2 main paths, right? There's the earned glory path. The hero succeeds externally, gets the kingdom like in Stardust, or finds that guaranteed perfect escape, like in the Pan's Labyrinth epilogue.
And then there's the other path, which seems maybe more common, or at least resonant in these examples, internal reconciliation. This is where the journey really forces the hero, and us with them, to accept a difficult truth about their actual reality. Like Dorothy realizing the magic was always back in Kansas, or Connor learning to live with grief but still feeling protected, or Max choosing that quiet dinner over the wild crown.
Exactly. And the common thread, the thing that synthesizes all of this, it really comes down to logical and emotional payoff. Does the ending feel earned? Does it connect logically back to the emotional journey the character went on?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how wild the plot gets. You can't just stop the story. You have to resolve the meaning of the story for the protagonist.
Right. These sources really show us that the most memorable fantasy endings often hinge on that act of reconciliation. You have to somehow reconcile the crazy fantastical journey with the reality, good or bad, that you return to. It's that moment maybe when the house lights come up metaphorically and you realize the magic actually served a purpose back in the real world. Which leads to maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If fantasy's biggest challenge is keeping us grounded while, flying off to Oz or wherever, does the most powerful, the most perfect ending always have to be the one that forces the hero and us to confront and accept the hardest parts of their original non-magical life? Do we only really value the escape if we truly understand what we needed escaping from?
Something to think about next time you watch the credits roll on a big fantasy epic.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of the perfect fantasy ending. We'll see you next time.